In the brittle winter of 1994, a small DNA testing lab in Roanoke received a routine sample, a vial of blood marked only with the initials MD. No one in the sterile white room could have guessed that those few crimson drops carried the remains of a ghost story, a lineage once scrubbed from official records, its name deliberately forgotten. The test was meant to trace hereditary illness. Instead, it unearthed something older, something that should have stayed buried beneath the clay hills of Virginia. The Dalton family had been erased nearly half a century earlier. In 1947, after years of state intervention, court-mandated sterilizations, and rural exile, the Department of Health quietly declared the bloodline cleansed. The phrase appeared in a single line of a yellowed document filed under genetic rehabilitation. It meant that whatever the Daltons once were, whatever sickness or sin had marked their generations, was gone. Or so they thought. But when the lab's computer matched MD to a genetic pattern that should have been impossible, the technician hesitated. The markers were too consistent, too ancient, threading back through identical strands found in long-sealed government archives. What emerged was not a simple family tree, but a recursive loop, a bloodline folding in on itself for over a century, untouched by outsiders. That night, the technician called Dr. Meredith Cole, a geneticist who had spent years studying the silent remnants of Appalachian isolation. The recording of that call still exists, her voice trembling as she whispered, "That can't be right." The Daltons were cleansed. Outside, the wind moved through the pines like something restless, something waking. And somewhere deep in the Virginia mountains, the last surviving Dalton stirred, unaware that the secret his ancestors died to bury had just been found in a drop of his own blood. In 1947, the Dalton family's name was struck from the official records of Virginia, erased with the clinical precision of a bureaucrat's pen. To the public, it was presented as an act of mercy, an administrative correction to close a shameful chapter in the state's rural history. For generations, whispers had haunted the Dalton name. They were said to live in the backwoods beyond the last paved road, where the trees grew so thick that sunlight could barely reach the ground. Neighbors claimed the family had turned inward long ago, marrying only within their own blood, guided by a warped belief that purity was their salvation. The children were born pale and strange-eyed, often sickly, their minds flickering between brilliance and madness. By the early 1940s, the authorities intervened under the pretense of science and moral hygiene, driven by the eugenics programs that swept through America's rural corners. Social workers arrived under the watch of armed deputies, removing the youngest and sterilizing the rest. Their report called the Daltons genetically compromised. A judge's order followed, recommending complete bloodline cessation. The phrase that sealed their fate came from a state health officer: "The Dalton bloodline has been cleansed." The family's farmhouse was boarded up, their graves unmarked, their possessions auctioned off in secret. The few surviving relatives were relocated under new surnames, given work in factories and farms far from the mountains. Local residents were told not to speak their name again, and within a few years, it was as if the Daltons had never existed. What no one spoke of were the files, boxes of records locked away in the basement of a county courthouse, containing photographs, medical notes, and fragments of the family's genealogy scrawled in trembling handwriting. Rumors persisted that some officials saw the Daltons not just as victims of their own isolation, but as something unnatural, a living experiment that had gone too far. Farmers swore the land where their house once stood never grew right again. Hunters claimed they still saw lights moving through the trees, long after the last Dalton was taken away. The cleansing was meant to bring closure, but instead it birthed a silence so heavy that even the mention of their name felt forbidden. Generations later, people driving through the hollow would still lower their voices, saying the air there felt different, charged with something unseen. The phrase cleansed bloodline became a myth, a ghost story told around fires, until time turned it into nothing more than a regional legend. But beneath the official papers and the language of science, the truth was much darker. The cleansing was not the end of the Daltons, it was only the burial of their name, not their blood. In the years that followed their official erasure, the Dalton descendants scattered like ash in the wind, carrying with them fragments of a past they were told never to speak of. Between the 1950s and the late 1980s, they lived quietly, hiding in plain sight under new names, their origins carefully disguised in layers of ordinary life. Most of them believed the family curse, if it could be called that, had been buried with their grandparents. They became factory workers, schoolteachers, and farmhands, moving from one small town to another, never staying long enough for neighbors to ask questions. Their lineage existed only in faint physical echoes, eyes too pale to belong to their supposed ancestry, an unusual resistance to illness, or the occasional uncanny resemblance between distant cousins who had never met. For decades, the world forgot them, and they, in turn, learned to forget themselves. But silence does not erase blood. The surviving Daltons carried the remnants of an isolated gene pool that defied easy explanation. Some families noticed patterns they could not speak of. Children born with peculiar sensitivities, hearing sounds no one else could, dreaming vividly of places they had never been. One Dalton descendant, a woman living in North Carolina, refused to have her children photographed, convinced that something in their faces might betray them. Another kept his birth certificate locked away, its original surname scratched out and replaced in typewriter ink. Though the name was gone, the fear endured, passed down like an inheritance no one wanted. In rural towns where the Daltons had once lived, older residents still remembered the disappearances, the state vans, and the men in white coats who had come for the good of the people. They spoke of those days only when drunk or dying, their memories stitched together with half-truths and superstition. Some said the Daltons had intermarried with outsiders, diluting whatever darkness had marked them. Others believed their blood remained intact, only sleeping. A few whispered that the family had made a pact long ago, to scatter but never truly mix, to preserve something ancient within themselves. By the 1970s, when genetic research was just beginning to unravel the mysteries of inheritance, the Daltons existed as ghosts in census data, missing records, mismatched birth dates, inexplicable genetic similarities between strangers states apart. They had become a living absence, their past scrubbed clean by the government yet preserved in the quiet defiance of their DNA. While most families passed down heirlooms or stories, the Daltons passed down silence. They lived uneventful lives, the kind that never drew attention, never left a trace. But in that silence lay the seed of discovery, waiting for the moment when science would finally look deep enough to see what time had tried to hide. In 1994, Dr. Meredith Cole was a quiet name in the scientific community, known for her work on rural genetic isolation and hereditary disorders among small Appalachian populations. Her research was never sensational, it dealt with statistics, medical records, and genetic drift among communities that had lived for generations in the same mountain hollows. But her curiosity often led her into forgotten corners of state archives, where she traced patterns that didn't quite make sense. One afternoon, while reviewing outdated census documents and sealed public health files, she noticed a gap, an entire family lineage that ended abruptly in the late 1940s, with no subsequent data, no marriage records, no birth certificates. The name on the file was familiar, though faint in the margins of local folklore, the Daltons. Their documentation was strange, filled with redactions and notations stamped restricted access. For a scientist like Cole, that kind of silence was louder than any evidence. She began digging deeper, requesting clearance to review old state health department archives under the guise of studying genetic diseases in rural communities. What she found were fragmented reports, medical notes written in trembling cursive, faded photographs, and official statements describing a family cleansed of its hereditary flaws. The phrasing disturbed her, it was cold, impersonal, and utterly devoid of compassion. Yet what unsettled her most was the genetic data included in the files. It suggested abnormalities far beyond the usual range of inherited disorders. The alleles repeated too cleanly, too consistently, as though the family's gene pool had folded in on itself for generations. The pattern was mathematically improbable, the kind of thing that should not exist outside controlled breeding experiments. At first, she assumed the data was a clerical error, the result of primitive record-keeping from a less ethical era of science. But then came the sample, a blood test from a living subject submitted for a medical study on anemia. When she ran the analysis, the results matched the Dalton pattern precisely. That blood, drawn from a man with no known family history, mirrored a genetic sequence thought to have been wiped from existence half a century ago. Cole's hands trembled as the data appeared on her monitor. The numbers didn't lie. The Dalton bloodline had survived. In that moment, fascination turned to dread. She understood what the discovery meant, not just for science, but for history. It meant that the state's cleansing had failed, that somewhere, descendants of the erased family still lived among ordinary people, unaware of what flowed through their veins. Alone in her lab, under the cold hum of fluorescent light, Dr. Cole realized she had resurrected a family the world had tried to forget. The discovery began with what was supposed to be a routine medical procedure. In the spring of 1994, a man in his 30s participated in a genetic screening program conducted at a small clinic in Roanoke. The purpose of the test was ordinary: to identify markers for hereditary illnesses common in Appalachian populations. His sample, labeled only with a set of initials, was entered into a database alongside hundreds of others. The lab technician, unaware of the storm she was about to awaken, ran the results through the new DNA analysis software that had just been introduced to the clinic. The data came back flagged for irregularities, displaying a series of genetic markers that didn't match any known medical profile. At first, it was assumed to be an error in the sequencing process, perhaps a corrupted data entry or a contaminated sample. But when the test was repeated, the same pattern emerged again: unusual alleles repeating with uncanny precision, a genetic signature that seemed too symmetrical, too controlled, as if engineered rather than inherited through natural lineage. Dr. Meredith Cole, who had already been studying rural genetic anomalies, was alerted to the strange results. When she cross-referenced the DNA profile with her archived research files, her heart began to race. The sequence was identical to one she had seen only once before, in the classified Dalton family records from the 1940s. Those records had been deemed historical artifacts of a eugenics-era cleansing operation and were never supposed to correspond to a living individual. Yet here it was evidence that the Dalton bloodline still existed, disguised beneath decades of silence and altered identities. The implications were chilling. The man whose blood carried that pattern had no idea who his ancestors were beyond his grandparents. His family name was different, his background ordinary, and his life unremarkable. But within his cells lay the blueprint of a lineage that was supposed to have ended generations ago. When Cole ran additional tests, the anomalies deepened. Genetic mutations associated with long-term inbreeding appeared alongside markers of rare resilience, traits that seemed to defy conventional biology. It was as though the Dalton genome had preserved itself through a form of self-replication, insulated from outside genetic influence. The DNA test that was meant to diagnose a medical condition had become something far greater. It was proof that the erasure of the Dalton family had never been complete, that their blood had not vanished but simply gone underground, hidden within the bodies of descendants who never knew their true origins. The revelation marked the moment when science accidentally reopened a grave sealed 50 years before, and from that grave, the Dalton legacy began to breathe again. When the DNA match reached the state's genetic registry, it triggered a chain of events that no one fully anticipated. Under routine procedure, any unidentified genetic anomaly was to be cross-referenced against archived medical data. But the Dalton files were not meant to be opened again. They had been sealed under a permanent confidentiality order decades earlier, stored in a government warehouse in Richmond where the dust of forgotten history lay thick over steel cabinets. When Dr. Meredith Cole requested access to confirm her findings, she expected bureaucratic resistance, but instead she received an unnerving silence. Weeks passed before she was contacted by a retired clerk who warned her that some records were classified for reasons beyond science. That phrase lingered in her mind. When she finally gained limited clearance to review the documents, what she uncovered made her question whether the state's efforts to erase the Dalton bloodline were motivated purely by eugenic policy or by something far stranger. The files revealed a campaign that went far deeper than sterilization. Reports described entire branches of the family relocated to undisclosed facilities, their children placed under state guardianship with altered identities. Medical notes detailed experimental treatments, enforced isolation, and disturbing descriptions of behavioral anomalies. Several officials referred to the Daltons not as patients, but as subjects. One document, written by a health administrator in 1946, mentioned termination of containment protocols, implying the family had been monitored under conditions similar to a quarantine. The accompanying photographs showed pale-faced individuals staring blankly into the camera, their features unsettlingly symmetrical, their eyes reflecting something that looked more like fear than illness. Among the files were transcripts from psychiatric interviews in which Dalton family members spoke of the voice in the blood, a phrase repeated across multiple generations. Some claimed they were not cursed but chosen, that their isolation was self-imposed to preserve what they called the original strain. The language was archaic and ritualistic, hinting at beliefs older than any medical framework could explain. There were even reports of state employees resigning after witnessing incidents they refused to document, citing spiritual distress. Dr. Cole realized then that the so-called cleansing had been less an act of mercy and more a cover-up, an attempt to erase not only the physical existence of a family but also the record of what the state had done to them. The Dalton name had been buried beneath scientific jargon and bureaucratic procedure, yet their truth persisted, trapped in folders no one dared open. By unsealing those documents, Cole had not just rediscovered a forgotten lineage, she had disturbed something that had been deliberately hidden from the world, something the state itself seemed afraid to remember. The story of the missing Dalton generation was a puzzle that had haunted local historians for decades. In the 1930s, a branch of the family had simply vanished, leaving behind abandoned farms and empty homes scattered across the Appalachian foothills. Neighbors recalled seeing the family loaded into trucks by federal agents during what was described at the time as a relocation program, part of a series of initiatives aimed at moving impoverished and problematic families to work farms or medical facilities elsewhere. But no records ever fully explained where they had gone. Birth certificates stopped midstream, marriage records were blank, and census takers could only note family removed in the margins of their ledgers. It was as if the Daltons had been erased not only from the maps of Virginia but also from memory itself. Rumors circulated among the surrounding communities, whispered in churches and along fence lines. Some townsfolk claimed the family had been sent to distant mental health institutions, their existence erased to prevent shame from spreading. Others told darker stories that the Daltons had been experimented upon, their lives catalogued in hidden files for reasons no one dared speak aloud. The more fanciful claims suggested that the family had been sent deep into the mountains, isolated in makeshift compounds to prevent their tainted blood from mixing with the rest of society. Whatever the truth, every attempt to trace them led to dead ends. Mail returned undelivered, friends and distant relatives vanished, and all public records seemed to hit an invisible wall. Despite this disappearance, traces of the family's genetic legacy persisted. Years later, Dr. Meredith Cole would notice these anomalies while examining DNA samples collected from descendants in nearby counties. People who had no recorded connection to the Daltons carried markers identical to those listed in the state archives. These markers were not minor deviations, they were precise echoes of the vanished generation, a hidden fingerprint of a family that was never meant to exist again. Even decades of movement, name changes, and isolation had not been enough to fully obscure their bloodline. The missing generation became a symbol of both mystery and dread. Oral histories described children with unnaturally pale skin and odd behaviors appearing in nearby towns, only to disappear without explanation. Some families claimed to have taken them in temporarily, only to have the children vanish again overnight. The idea of a family lost to history became less a matter of curiosity and more an undercurrent of fear, an unspoken understanding that the Daltons had not simply left but had been forcibly removed, leaving a genetic echo that would resurface decades later. By the time the 1990s arrived, the existence of this missing generation was no longer just a story or a rumor, it was a tangible reality. DNA testing revealed that what had once seemed impossible, the survival of the Dalton lineage despite official erasure, was not only possible but verifiable, connecting the vanished children of the 1930s to living descendants who had no knowledge of their ancestors. The disappearance that had baffled historians became the key to unlocking a bloodline that was supposed to have been extinguished forever. The discovery of Samuel Dalton's journal was a turning point that shifted the Dalton story from rumor and record into something almost uncomfortably intimate. Found in the attic of a crumbling farmhouse scheduled for demolition, the leather-bound notebook was brittle, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. It had been hidden beneath loose floorboards, covered in decades of dust and soot, as if deliberately preserved by hands that had wanted it to survive long enough to be discovered. The first entries were innocuous, filled with the minutiae of daily life, weather, livestock, and the occasional barter with neighbors, but as the pages progressed, a darker obsession emerged, one that charted a family belief that had long remained unspoken outside their walls. Samuel wrote of rituals meant to purify the blood, practices passed down from father to son, mother to daughter, intended to safeguard the family from what he described as outside corruption. Marriage between cousins was not merely customary, it was sacred. Any deviation, he wrote, would risk the loss of the family's essence. These rituals were meticulous, blending folklore and superstition with a pseudoscientific obsession with heredity. Samuel described observing the growth and development of his children as though they were experiments, noting patterns of health, intelligence, and temperament with the precision of a scholar and the fervor of a zealot. The tone of the journal changed as it neared the late 1930s. Samuel began to record the consequences of the family's isolation and intermarriage. Some children were born weak, others brilliant but unpredictable, many afflicted with ailments he considered both curse and test. He wrote not with despair, but with a strange pride, convinced that the family's blood carried something unique, something that could not survive outside the mountains. He warned that outsiders would never understand, that their intrusion would bring ruin to the family line. The entries became increasingly ritualistic, almost incantatory, and included diagrams, dates, and coded instructions for ceremonies meant to safeguard their lineage. It was not simply a diary, it was a blueprint of obsession, a manual for a family's survival at the cost of its social existence. Each page pulsed with a sense of urgency, the kind that comes from believing one is guarding a secret the world cannot know. Reading it, one felt the weight of generations compressed into meticulous words, a family convinced that their blood was both sacred and dangerous, a living testament to the consequences of isolation and secrecy. By the time Dr. Meredith Cole examined the journal, she realized it was more than a curiosity. It offered insight into the psychological and cultural framework that had allowed the Daltons to evade complete extinction. The rituals, the obsessive tracking of lineage, the meticulous recording of each child's traits, all of it explained how a bloodline that had been declared cleansed could persist quietly, invisibly, until science stumbled upon it decades later. Samuel Dalton had not merely chronicled his family, he had preserved the essence of their existence for a future that no one had anticipated. The return of Dalton descendants across the United States was as astonishing as it was unsettling. Following the revelations from DNA testing and archival records, Dr. Meredith Cole began tracing living relatives who had no idea of their connection to one another, much less to a family officially declared cleansed decades earlier. Letters, public records, and the faintest of genealogical traces led her to quiet towns and unassuming suburbs, where individuals lived lives completely unaware of the extraordinary history embedded in their veins. For some, the discovery was merely academic; for others, it was the beginning of a psychological upheaval, a realization that their own bodies carried secrets older than their own memories. The patterns Cole uncovered were impossible to ignore. People who had never met shared striking physical similarities, subtle facial features, eye shapes, and expressions that seemed oddly familiar when viewed side by side. More unsettling were the shared tendencies that emerged. Some descendants exhibited unusual cognitive quirks, heightened sensitivity to sound or light, or inexplicable health conditions that mirrored reports in the Dalton archives. It became apparent that the genetic anomalies, thought to have been eliminated by decades of isolation and sterilization programs, had persisted quietly, threading through ordinary families who believed themselves entirely unremarkable. In several cases, the descendants had family stories, fragments of odd behaviors or unexplained deaths, but none connected the dots to a broader lineage. One woman recounted her grandmother's warning never to marry within the county, a caution whose origin had been dismissed as superstition. Another discovered a pattern of early deaths among male relatives, a phenomenon that matched archival descriptions of the Dalton family's history. The coincidences were eerie, suggesting that biology had preserved truths that social intervention could not erase. As the network of living Daltons slowly emerged, it became clear that the bloodline was no longer a matter of history alone, it was a living, breathing presence. Some of the descendants reacted with fascination, eager to connect with newfound cousins and learn the story of their family. Others recoiled, horrified to think that the very identity they had built over decades rested upon a foundation society had deemed undesirable. The unearthing of these connections challenged long-held assumptions about identity, heredity, and the power of institutional intervention. Through it all, one fact remained undeniable: the Daltons had survived not through defiance alone, but through meticulous secrecy, quiet dispersion, and the hidden persistence of their genetic code. What had been written off as a cleansed lineage was now revealed to be remarkably resilient. Science had illuminated what history had tried to erase, and in doing so, it revealed a family that was at once ordinary and extraordinary, dispersed yet unmistakably united, a lineage whose presence was both a miracle of survival and a haunting reminder of the past's inescapable shadow. By 1994, the Dalton story had already begun to capture attention, but it was the local news broadcast that transformed it from academic curiosity into public horror. When Dr. Meredith Cole confirmed the DNA match linking living individuals to the supposedly cleansed family, the station seized the opportunity for a feature segment that would air one chilly evening in Virginia. The report was carefully worded at first, framing the discovery as a scientific anomaly, a story of forgotten genealogical threads re-emerging through modern technology. Yet, as footage of archival photographs and the rolling Appalachian hills appeared on screen, the segment took on a darker tone. Faces long thought erased stared back from black and white images, pale-eyed children and solemn adults whose expressions seemed to speak across decades. Viewers across the region, many of whom had heard whispers of the Daltons as a ghost story in their youth, were confronted with tangible proof that the family had never fully disappeared. The broadcast included interviews with Dr. Cole and a few of the living descendants who had consented to appear. Their reactions were a mix of disbelief, fear, and a quiet unease that suggested the weight of generations pressing upon them. The descendants spoke cautiously, unsure how to explain what they themselves were only beginning to understand. One young man, unaware of his true heritage until the DNA results, described a strange sense of déjà vu when he saw the photographs of children who looked uncannily like him. Another recounted faint memories of family warnings and old stories dismissed as superstition, now suddenly vivid and chillingly relevant. The broadcast lingered on these personal testimonies, amplifying the human dimension of a story that was otherwise rooted in sterile science and historical documents. Reaction to the segment was immediate and intense. Calls poured into the station from viewers claiming to recognize the family from old rural communities, some reporting long-forgotten encounters or unexplained events that suddenly made sense. Local historians scrambled to reconcile their records with the revelations, while law enforcement reviewed decades-old files that had been considered closed. The story sparked debates over morality, genetics, and the ethics of state intervention, but beneath the intellectual discourse ran a current of fear, a realization that the Daltons, in some form, had never truly been gone. In households across the region, conversations that had been avoided for decades resurfaced. Neighbors recounted tales of fleeting glimpses of pale children in the woods or odd behaviors that had seemed meaningless. The broadcast did more than inform, it awakened a collective memory that society had tried to suppress. For the descendants, it was both validation and terror, a public exposure of a secret they had lived with unknowingly, a confrontation with the reality that their lineage carried a legacy far older and far darker than anyone had imagined. In that moment, the Daltons stepped out of the shadows of history, their presence undeniable, their story irrevocably entwined with the present. In 2023, nearly 3 decades after the DNA revelations first shocked the Appalachian communities, the Dalton bloodline resurfaced in an entirely unexpected way. A young descendant, curious about their ancestry, uploaded their raw DNA data to a popular ancestry website, seeking nothing more than the usual piecemeal information about distant cousins and ethnic origins. The platform, designed to match users with genetic relatives across the globe, triggered an alert almost immediately. The system flagged a match with an unidentified sample in a state medical archive, a relic from the 1994 research that had first uncovered the surviving Daltons. What had been buried in bureaucratic files, classified and forgotten by most of the scientific community, now emerged in a digital instant. The automated alert sent ripples through Dr. Meredith Cole's team, now long experienced in genetic tracing but still unprepared for the implications of this new connection. The descendant, unaware of the full history, received a notification that they had a genetic match with an unknown individual tied to archived state data. When Cole analyzed the match, she realized it was no ordinary discovery. The genetic sequence mirrored that of the original Dalton samples from the 1940s, showing the same series of anomalies, the same inbred markers, and the same unusual patterns that had first hinted at the family's extraordinary isolation. The bloodline, thought to have been largely dispersed and diluted, had resurfaced intact enough to be recognized by modern technology. This event demonstrated the persistence of the Dalton legacy in ways even science could not have fully predicted. Decades of altered surnames, relocation, and obscured family histories had not prevented the family's genetic footprint from being traceable. The very tools designed to connect people casually to their distant relatives had inadvertently reopened a story that had been closed for generations. In homes across the country, descendants who had assumed themselves unrelated now found themselves linked by a chain of DNA that was at once remarkable and disturbing. It was a living proof that the state's efforts to erase a lineage had never truly succeeded, that no amount of bureaucratic intervention could completely extinguish what nature had preserved. For the family, this digital revelation carried a weight that went beyond genealogy. It forced them to confront the invisible inheritance of their past, the patterns of illness, resilience, and isolation embedded in their biology. For the broader public, it raised questions about the limits of science and history, about the ethics of erasure, and the enduring power of ancestry. The Dalton bloodline, once declared cleansed, was alive, persistent, and now visible in ways no one could ignore. What had begun as a routine upload to a genealogy website became the latest chapter in a story that stretched back nearly a century, a reminder that some secrets refuse to remain buried and some legacies endure far longer than anyone expects.